Towards the end of the 60s, Concorde was nearing completion, and the public was kept up to date with enthusiastic corporate films. The 6 months ending January 1967 was a significant stage in the progress of the Anglo-French Concorde supersonic airliner. Here at Sud Aviation's Toulouse factory, the first prototype 001 was practically completed as an aeroplane structure. This is how 001 looked at the beginning of the period mid-1966. Construction work was on schedule then, and it remained so. And the target date for 001's first flight remained the 28th of February 1968. Production of major structural components for the prototypes had been allocated to various factories. This is one of the assemblies, the fuselage nose, built at the British Aircraft Corporation's Weybridge factory. A similar subdivision of work would be followed in the series production of Concorde, with individual factories providing components for both the British and French final assembly lines. At another BAC factory in Preston, the rear fuselage assembly was produced. In the making of this and other Concorde components, new production problems were encountered. This is inevitable in the manufacture of an aircraft prototype, particularly the prototype of an aircraft as advanced as Concorde, the world's first supersonic airliner. But the problems were overcome. The components were completed and delivered on time. One of the largest components was the aircraft fin, another BAC Weybridge-built assembly. The fin, like the wing and other highly loaded areas, had its skin panels integrally milled from the solid metal billet for maximum strength. The movement by road of the large sub-assemblies was in itself a considerable transport operation, involving careful timing and planning. This was the start of a typical road lift, the departure from the Weybridge factory of the 001 nose assembly. Its destination was the BAC Filton division at Bristol. Smooth going for Concorde's fin on the westbound motorway. Arrival at Filton of the 001 rear fuselage assembly from Preston. All British-built components for 001 were equipped here before being dispatched to Toulouse. It's at Filton that the second prototype 002 was being built. And this huge aircraft assembly hall would be the home of the British production line for Concorde. The nose assembly from Weybridge was one of several large sections which converged on Filton in the space of a few hours in August. It was closely followed by the fin, also from Weybridge. This was a wide load, and to help negotiate roundabouts and other obstructions en route, it could be raised at an angle on the vehicle. Late in August, but again bang on time, the first French-built components for the second prototype reached Filton. The vehicle and its load had travelled direct from Toulouse by road and cross-channel car ferry. This was the normal method for moving Concorde components between Toulouse and Filton. But at the end of August, a special airlift from Filton to Toulouse had to be laid on. The aircraft used for this operation was a Belfast military transport made available by the Royal Air Force, and the component was the tail fuselage. It had to go by air because during the rush of return from holiday traffic in France at the time, the movement of heavy loads by road was banned by French police. It was essential that the component reach Toulouse on the 31st of August, otherwise Sud Aviation would have lost precious days on the production schedule. And even as preparations of the Belfast airlift were going ahead, another French component for 002 reached Filton, Section 20, a fuselage and wing assembly made at Sud Aviation's Saint-Nazaire works. On the morning of the 31st of August, the Belfast prepares to take off from the Filton airfield, scene of many historic flights. In 1968, in September of that year, this same airfield will see the first flight of the second Concorde prototype. In the meantime, the Belfast helped to get at least a section of Concorde airborne. In 2 hours' time, the tail fuselage would be at Toulouse, and thanks to the RAF, that all-important program date would have been met. Some 3 weeks later, the Filton-built forward fuselage for 001 left for Toulouse. This time the movement was by road, in a special vehicle built to the Filton Transport Department's own design. Again, the month end saw an arrival from France, another large centre fuselage wing section for 002. It was sometimes suggested that there must be special difficulties in assembling an airframe from components made in separate factories hundreds of miles apart and in different countries, but this wasn't so. At Filton, French-built and British-built components fit smoothly into place on the final assembly jig as the second prototype began to take shape. Perfect mating of the components was ensured by the use of established manufacturing techniques that would still be needed even if the individual sections were built in adjoining shops. The Filton assembly jig, September 1966, the aft section of 002. The scene in December. Although outwardly there's not much visible change, a vast amount of detailed work has been done. "600 miles away in Toulouse, work on the first prototype was even further advanced, necessarily so to meet its earlier flight date. This is how 001 looked in September, already recognizably an aeroplane.
This, the first Concorde airframe, is tangible evidence that Anglo-French collaboration on the supersonic airliner is working, and working effectively. It is well to remember that the work of the production men has been made possible and practicable by the years of effort put into Concorde research and development by thousands of other workers in laboratories, wind tunnels, and drawing offices. Because of their work, an airliner that would have seemed a dream a decade ago today takes solid form on the shop floor. The solid form, for example, of engine nacelles, one of the few Concorde components to be made in stainless steel. In the jig, the starboard engine bay for 001. And already out of the jig, the port bay. During these 6 months, testing and development of the Concorde's Olympus 593 turbojets has made rapid progress. A Vulcan bomber, adapted by Bristol Siddeley as a flying test bed for a production type 593, has been used to explore the engine's subsonic flight envelope and for air intake testing. And SNECMA's research center at Villaroche near Paris is playing a major role in the comprehensive Olympus ground test program. Back to Toulouse for a last look at 001 in January 1967. And a final reminder that if engineers and production workers were busy in these 6 months, so too were the sales force. In that time, nearly 20 Concorde options were added to the growing list, and there are many more to come.
The newsreels of the era were also excited by Concorde. Bristol, London to New York in 3 hours, 17 minutes. That was the promise of the Concorde taking shape at Filton in the Brabazon hangar. The Anglo-French supersonic airliners were pushing ahead towards completion, one in Britain, one in France. They would be the first faster-than-sound airliners in the world, 1,450 miles an hour, most of the way at 11 miles high. It was thought Concorde would give Britain and France a 3-year lead over America's supersonic aircraft hopes. Also at Filton, a full-scale mock-up of the aircraft. The British hoped it would fly in the autumn of 1968. This was the last chance for prospective buyers to suggest such minor changes as seating in the 186-foot fuselage, accommodating 136 passengers. A new era in airliners. On the 11th of December 1967, The very first completed Concorde 001 was rolled out at Toulouse in France. It was a greatly celebrated moment by all the officials who took part in the ceremony. But it would be another 15 months before Concorde would actually fly. Still, this was an auspicious moment. But Concorde had a rival. The Russian-built Tupolev Tu-144, called the Concordski by the West. Its first flight was on the 31st of December 1968, several months before Concorde. While it looked very similar to Concorde, it was not as technologically advanced. Still, the Soviets had beaten the West into the supersonic passenger aircraft era. But the Tu-144 was doomed. On the 3rd of June 1973, one crashed at the Paris Air Show. Still, Concordski finally entered regular service months ahead of Concorde. But on the 23rd of May 1978, another one crashed. It was withdrawn from regular service on the 1st of June 1978. Even so, at the moment of its first flight, the Russians were very proud. Still, Concorde had competition from other sources. The 707 had been put into service by British Airways, allowing it to expand its service worldwide, as the newsreel showed. The Boeing 707 jetliner built up speed under full throttle. From home base, BOAC was blazing another trail. A new trade route to distant places. From London to Japan, the quick way. Over the North Pole. With England a dwindling checkerboard several miles below, the course for the east was set, due north. In their pressurized comfort, the customers relaxed as the high-flying jet cleaved through the stratosphere towards the roof of the world. This was Britain's same aeroplane service from London to Osaka, a flight into the history books of British aviation. Down there it was bleak, cold, uninviting. On board, it was very different. Already the influence of the land of the rising sun was apparent. Specially trained Japanese air hostesses saw to that. So with Anchorage, the first stop, a few short hours away, passengers enjoyed some of the high life that comes as standard for the fare-paying public. What you might call cuisine of the clouds. Most of the 4,500-mile first leg from London up and over to Alaska had slipped uneventfully behind. That was Mount McKinley down there. Men have risked their lives, some indeed have died in their efforts to reach the North Pole, that mysterious point that caps the world. Snug in their personal temperature-controlled capsule, passengers and crew had journeyed north easily. There's been nothing unusual to see, no feeling of anything different. Modern technology, combined with months of planning, has smoothed the way for the new polar flight path. The first hop was over. This was Anchorage, seaport city of the 49th state of the United States. There was a warm hello in this pretty cold place, a land of snow, Eskimos, and those ring-a-ding days of the gold rush. Anchorage, flourishing city of skyscrapers and motorways, welcomed the polar pioneers. For the passengers, there was plenty of evidence of modern achievement in their first touchdown. Not up to jet-set standards, perhaps, but the snowmobile proved a fast and efficient way of scudding across the Alaskan ice packs. Admiring dog power was irresistible. Here was a romantic reminder of the pioneering past for the 20th century adventurers to savor. The old and the new, the polar flight was on its way once more, speeding over the snowcaps to new horizons. Next stop, Tokyo. From here, 3,500 miles away. Britain had established a new route. The BOAC Polar Service was knocking 8 hours off the old route across Asia. For businessmen, the 3 times a week service would mean a flight to profit, a high-speed cruise into the rising sun and the bright lights of Tokyo. Now, for tourists and traders alike, Japan's bustling business hub was under a day away from London. So too was Osaka, major manufacturing city and site of the next World Fair, just a pole vault away. But it was the Boeing 747 that would pose the greatest challenge to Concorde. The 747 was inspired by the success of the Boeing 707, and designers started working on it in 1965. Pan American Airways was a driving force behind its development, as it wanted an airliner with twice the capacity of the 707. In April 1965, Pan Am ordered 25 747s. They were huge aircraft, initially built to seat up to 452 passengers, with engines that could fly 5,300 miles. Their size meant new ways of assembling the aircraft had to be created to handle its vastness. Its interior was unlike anything ever seen. It was 21 feet wide, allowing for 2 aisles. Its catering facilities were immense. The forward fuselage allowed for 2 decks, thus giving first-class passengers their own bar. It was rolled out on the 30th of September 1968 to immense public interest. Experts predicted that Concordes and jumbo jets would operate side by side. The Anglo-French on the thinner routes and the Americans on the high-density ones. There was business enough for both, they said. Aircraft of these proportions would make flying for millions much more commonplace. Every statistic about the 747 was in a class of its own. 4 massive jets provided the power. Wingspan was just short of 196 feet, height 63 feet 6 inches. Compare it with the 707 jetliner. Even as a toy, the Boeing 747 makes a formidable armful. But to get the full impact of the size of the big bird, measure it against familiar things, like the far from small American car. Even a monster road container carrier seems like a chick under the huge wing. In a year's time, this new breed of giant jet will be roaring into the world's international airports, unloading passengers at a hitherto undreamed of rate. But its size meant the world's airports would have to get much bigger. Heathrow would have to expand. The jumbo jet, top speed 625 miles an hour, passenger payload 490. Soon the giants of the sky would be flying into a new-look Heathrow from all over the world. An airport that was already one of the busiest aviation crossroads would have to cope with an enormous upsurge of passenger traffic. For many months, London Airport had been preparing for the day when the doors of the first jumbo jet opened, and out would come the equivalent of 10 double-decker busloads of people, plus all their luggage. New hangars for the aircraft, more room for their passengers, expanding catering facilities, longer and stronger runways, speedier luggage handling. These are just a few of the problems which the airport authorities grappled with as more and more of the 231 feet long giant aircraft came off their American assembly lines. But while the airport geared itself for the inevitable flood of passengers, London too did something to cope with a sudden, massive influx of visitors. Road improvements would speed the way from the airport to the city centre. Hotels were expanding their existing premises, adding annexes, or being newly built on a larger scale than ever before. Somehow there had to be accommodation of a good standard for all those who wanted it, and there would be plenty of them, businessmen and holidaymakers. London had to be able to give them what they wanted and could pay for. From the airport arrival buildings would stream people of many nationalities at an unprecedented rate, expecting a welcome from the capital of the host country. Their first impressions would count for a lot as they sped along the motorway towards what was hoped was not a waiting bottleneck. London Airport became geared for the flying revolution which would enable more people than ever before to take to the air and visit those faraway places. And Britain, for many of them, was one of those places. The 747 was coming in a big way. As the 747 developed, construction of production versions of Concorde proceeded at Filton and Toulouse. Its very new technology was challenging to the builders. Concorde was a delta-winged aircraft with 4 Olympus engines. The engines were jointly built by Rolls-Royce and Snecmar. Concorde was the first civil airliner to have an analog fly-by-wire flight control system. It also employed a trademark droop snoot, lowering nose section for visibility on approach. Concorde had an average cruise speed of Mach 2.02, about 1,330 miles per hour, with a maximum cruise altitude of 60,000 feet, at more than twice the speed of conventional aircraft. The average landing speed was 185 miles per hour. The flight deck. Concorde pioneered the following technologies: for high speed and optimization of flight, double delta-shaped wings, variable inlet ramps controlled by digital computers, super cruise capability, thrust-by-wire engines, droop nose section for improved visibility on landing, for weight saving and enhanced performance, mainly aluminium construction for low weight and conventional manufacture. Higher speeds would have ruled out aluminium. Full regime autopilot and auto throttle, allowing hands-off control of the aircraft from climb out to landing. Fully electrically controlled analog fly-by-wire flight control systems. Multi-function flight control surfaces. Fully electrically controlled analog brake-by-wire system. Pitch trim by shifting fuel around the fuselage for center of gravity control. Parts made using sculpture milling from single alloy billet, reducing the part number count while saving weight and adding strength. The Concorde program's primary legacy is in the experience gained in the design and manufacture, which later became the basis of the Airbus consortium. Although Concorde was a technological marvel when introduced into service in the 1970s, 30 years later, its cockpit, cluttered with analog dials and switches, looked dated. With no competition, there was no commercial pressure to upgrade Concorde with enhanced avionics or passenger comfort, as occurred in other airliners of the same vintage, for example the Boeing 747. Due to the high speeds at which Concorde travelled, large forces were applied to the aircraft structure during banks and turns. This caused twisting and the distortion of the aircraft structure. This was resolved by the neutralization of the outboard elevons at high speeds. Only the innermost elevons, which are attached to the strongest area of the wings, are active at high speed. Additionally, the narrow fuselage meant that the aircraft flexed more, particularly during takeoff. Pilots were able to look back down the cabin and see this occurring, but it was less visible from most of the passengers' viewpoints. The cabins of both Air France and British Airways Concordes featured lavatories and bulkheads midway down the cabin to reduce the appearance of the long tube effect to passengers in the aft of the aircraft. Finally, Concorde was ready to fly. Its first flight was on the 2nd of March, 1969 in Toulouse. And the first British flight was on the 9th of April, 1969. Both were moments that captivated the world. Toulouse. Concorde 001 made her most important public appearance, back end first. She was being nosed out of her hangar by a tractor on the day for which Britain and France and the rest of the world had waited so long. The great giant supersonic jetliner was going to fly. A year late, millions of pounds over the estimated cost, and still a very big question mark. These were Concorde's first claims to fame, but on this day, a lot of those question marks will be answered. For Concorde 001, this was the chance to prove she was the superbird everyone had hoped and worked for. "193 feet long, with a 38-foot tail and a wingspan of 84 feet. Vital statistics of an Anglo-French lady who was all dressed up and ready to go places on the biggest date of her life. Keeping that date with the world's press, all eyes were glued to the sleek, futuristic machine standing on its spindly legs out there. Its droop snoot in the down position surveying the scene. At the other end, heat surged from the mighty Rolls-Royce engines as the ground crew checked, rechecked, and checked again. Concorde was buttoned up good and tight. There was little more anyone could do other than fly her. After 6 years of designing and building, delays and progress, the dream was a reality. Concorde nosed slowly out to the starting point of her flying career. The men chosen to crew the Speedbird on her maiden flight had plenty to do during the last few seconds before takeoff. The all-important final pre-flight check carried out by Chief Pilot André Turcat and his crew went without a hitch. This was it. With 12 tons of test equipment on board, André Turcat took Concorde up to 10,000 feet. She was almost ticking over at less than 300 miles an hour. Nose still in the droop position, undercarriage down. The less for the pilot to do, the better. Earthbound technicians waited for reports to come in. And what reports they were. Concorde handled beautifully. After only 27 minutes of flight, she was coming home. The weather was threatening, but the test pilot knew what he wanted to know. Concorde was coming back as a success. In a few years' time, the sight of Concordes on international airfields all over the world will be commonplace. Then there will be 130 passengers on board. Flying times would have been cut by half. London to New York from 7 hours 40 minutes to 3 hours 25 minutes. But for the moment, there's a lot more flight testing to be done. A long, lonely job for the French and British test pilots and their crew, but now was a time of triumph, and André Turcat was the hero. Jubilant senior executives of Sud Aviation and the British Aircraft Corporation greeted the tall Frenchman, who'd taken their machine on its successful maiden flight. Inside, the world's press wanted to hear Monsieur Turcat's verdict. "The big bird flies," he said. "It's the beginning of the big work." If that work went well, Britain and France would stand to make £4,000 million and lead the world of civil aviation. The eyes of the world were on Concorde 002 as she taxied towards the runway at Filton. It was Chief Test Pilot Brian Trubshaw's decision whether she flew or not. It could be another high-speed taxi test, but the great bird looked ready to fly, and fly she did. The red, white and blue of Britain's supersonic jet giant was a proud sight as she made her 22-minute maiden flight to RAF Fairford, where the 10,000-foot runway, one of the longest in the country, waited invitingly for the Anglo-French superjet to return to Earth. Gracefully, like a prehistoric winged monster, 002 felt for the ground. This was yet another day of success for the ambitious Anglo-French civil aviation project. The dream of years was a magnificent reality, putting both nations way ahead of the rest of the world and giving glimpses of the speedy 70s which lay ahead. This was a time for congratulations, for the world's press to clamour for success stories, and for front-page pictures. Still, quietly sitting at the controls was Brian Trubshaw. Engineers and specialists got down to quick, on-the-spot checks. The flight was over, the work just begun. The second Concorde, the British Concorde, had been proved a machine of the skies. André Turcat was there to congratulate his British test pilot teammate. Together they belonged to the exclusive club of Concorde pilots. What an achievement of aviation Britain and France had brought about. Supreme combined technology had shown the rest of the world a clean pair of heels. Concorde and the men who built and flew them had left their mark in the sky. Ironically, just as Concorde was taking to the skies in 1969, its predecessor, the Comet, was reborn as the RAF Nimrod, a maritime patrol aircraft. It's an extensive modification of the original de Havilland Comet, with a large weapons bay under the fuselage that can carry and drop torpedoes, mines, bombs and other stores. Sonar buoys for tracking submarines are dropped from special launchers in the rear of the fuselage. The Nimrod is also capable of carrying American-made Harpoon anti-ship missiles and Sidewinder air-to-air missiles for self-defense. It also serves in a reconnaissance and electronic intelligence gathering capacity. It continues to serve in places like Afghanistan. It remains a direct link to the early jet age of the late 1940s. Concorde began its flying program in earnest, although regular passenger flight was still some years away. As the flight program progressed, 001 embarked on a sales and demonstration tour on the 4th of September 1971. Concorde 002 followed suit on the 2nd of June 1972 with a tour of the Middle and Far East. Concorde 002 made the first visit to the United States in 1973, landing at the new Dallas-Fort Worth Regional Airport to mark that airport's opening. These trips led to orders for over 70 aircraft, but a combination of factors led to order cancellations. The 1973 oil crisis, financial difficulties of airlines, a spectacular Paris-Le Bourget airshow crash of the competing Soviet Tupolev Tu-144, and environmental concerns such as the sonic boom, takeoff noise and pollution. Only Air France and British Airways, successor to BOAC, took up their orders, with the two governments taking a cut of any profits made. In the case of BA, 80% of the profit was kept by the government until 1984. while the cost of buying the aircraft was covered by a government loan. The United States cancelled its supersonic transport SST program in 1971. Two designs had been submitted. The Lockheed L-2000, looking like a scaled-up Concorde, lost out to the Boeing 2707, which was intended to be faster, to carry 300 passengers, and feature a swing-wing design. Industry observers in France and the United Kingdom suggested that part of the American opposition to Concorde on grounds of noise pollution was orchestrated by, or at least encouraged by, the United States government out of spite at not being able to produce a viable competitor, despite President John F. Kennedy's impassioned 1963 statement of commitment. Other countries, such as India and Malaysia, ruled out Concorde supersonic overflights due to noise concerns. Demonstration and test flights were flown from 1974 onwards. The testing of Concorde set records that have not been surpassed. The prototype, pre-production and first production aircraft undertook 5,335 flight hours. A total of 2,000 test hours were at supersonic speeds. Unit costs were £23 million, 46 million American dollars in 1977. Development cost was 6 times the projected amount. But it was the entry of the Boeing 747 into scheduled flight that probably hurt the Concorde the most. The 747 entered service on January the 22nd, 1970, on Pan Am's New York to London route. The Boeing 747 is a large, wide-bodied, two-aisle airliner with 4 wing-mounted engines. The wings have a high sweep angle of 37.5 degrees for a fast, efficient cruise of Mach 0.84 to 0.88, depending on the variant. The sweep also allows the 747 to use existing hangars. Seating capacity is more than 366, with a 3-4-3 seat arrangement. A cross-section of 3 seats, an aisle, 4 seats, another aisle and 3 seats in economy class, and a 2-3-2 arrangement in first class on the main deck. The upper deck has a 3-3 seat arrangement in economy class and a 2-2 arrangement in first class. The 747 enjoyed a fairly smooth introduction into service, overcoming concerns that some airports would not be able to accommodate an aircraft that large. Although technical problems occurred, they were relatively minor and quickly solved. After the aircraft's introduction with Pan Am, other airlines that had bought the 747 in order to stay competitive began to put their own aircraft into service. Boeing estimated that half of the early 747 sales were to airlines requiring the aircraft's long range rather than its payload capacity. But although the 747 had the lowest potential operating cost per seat, this could only be achieved when the aircraft was fully loaded. Cost per seat increased rapidly as occupancy declined. A moderately loaded 747, one with only 70% of its seats occupied, used more than 95% of the fuel needed by a fully occupied 747. Because of the large number of people it could carry, ticket prices began to fall, and now large numbers of middle-class passengers could begin taking flights to exciting destinations. Places like Las Vegas, Nevada in the western US, the gambling capital of the world, started to draw huge crowds from all over the globe, including Britain. Concorde still hung on, however.
Superimposed on a tract of lifeless rock and burning sand. We're on the famous Strip, where every ritzy casino has its swimming pools and palm tree gardens, and the summer heat is delightfully tempered by the dry desert air and enlivened with all that's comely. You can't get more sumptuous than this. You get free food often enough, inexpensive rooms, and top entertainment at all the casinos. But you can never escape from the gambling machines, which make profits that are as fabulous as the place itself. Packing up the gaming chips is a major mechanized endeavor, and a measure of the wealth that is whooshed away on one-armed bandits, on dim dice bones, on blackjack or roulette. Go to Las Vegas, and if you don't gamble, you can have the cheapest and most fabulous holiday that exists, because the vast gaming profits have subsidized everything else. And now you feel that the whole hydroelectric output of the Hoover Dam is in action. There are people who swear that Las Vegas, the synthetic city sited slap in the middle of a desert, is brighter and lighter at midnight than it is at midday. And the fun goes on non-stop every 24 hours. Just drink it in, the color, the vulgarity, the scope, and the whole incredible spectacle. There's really nothing more than this that one need say.
In 1969, at the Trooping of the Colour, celebrating the Queen's birthday, Concorde flew over the palace in tribute to Her Majesty.
The ceremony, the bands, the crowds, all that memorable days are made of. On this fine day in June, the Queen celebrated her official birthday. The colour had been trooped. In their thousands, visitors and Londoners alike homed on the heart of the metropolis, packing the royal route to see Her Majesty go home to Buckingham Palace, escorted by her soldiers. The soldiers of the Queen, the bandsmen, the horses. A London decked in summer colours and bathed by hot sunshine. It was a sight and an occasion hard to equal anywhere else in the world. In perfect order, around the Victoria Memorial came the troops to pass before the Queen, who had taken up position between the open gates of the palace. In their magnificent dress uniforms, the soldiers, as usual, played their immaculate part in this London spectacular. It was a proud sight, but this was also a day when the traditional and the modern were brought together. The British Concorde, that masterpiece of technology, came to London to be seen by the Queen, her family, and the millions who looked up with excitement for a first glimpse of the great plane. There was much excitement on the balcony of Buckingham Palace as the roar of 16 RAF Lightning fighters heralded the arrival of Concorde 002. There was no doubt about the impact Concorde had made as she bowed to London. It had been a day of spectacle, sunshine, and achievement. A day to remember.
Finally, in late 1975, Concorde was prepared to enter service with British Airways and Air France. It had been nearly 7 years since its inaugural flight, but now it was getting ready. Many design problems had to be overcome to make it safe, but its moment had finally arrived. Scheduled flights began on the 21st of January 1976 on the London to Bahrain and Paris to Rio via Dakar routes. It was a very proud moment for its designers and its pilots. Concorde was truly ready to take off. And it did. For the passengers aboard Concorde, it was a first-class plus experience. They were very well looked after by cabin staff.
Madame, vous allez coucher? Non, on peut enlever. Oui, mais on peut l'enlever. Non, vous n'êtes pas le deuxième?
Champagne flowed like water, and meals were like those from some very expensive restaurant. Of course, it was expensive for the passengers, but they seemed to enjoy the attention.
Monsieur, un peu de champagne?
In regular service, Concorde employed an efficient cruise climb flight profile. As aircraft lose weight from consuming fuel, they can fly at progressively higher altitudes. This is generally more efficient, so conventional airliners employ a stepped climb profile, where air traffic control will approve a change to a higher flight level as the flight progresses. Concorde flew fast enough that the weight of everyone on board was temporarily reduced by about 1% when flying east. This was due to centrifugal effects, since the airspeed added to the rotation speed of the Earth. Flying west, the weight increased by about 0.3% because it cancelled out the normal rotation, and with it the normal centrifugal force, and replaced it with a smaller rotation in the opposite direction. Concorde flew high enough that the weight of everyone on board was reduced by an additional 0.6% due to the increased distance from the center of the Earth.
j'adore. Questa qui. Molto bellina, io che gioco molto sono felice, grazie.
But the route that Concorde was primarily designed for, New York, was not allowed. The US Congress banned it from flying into US airspace. A bite at the Big Apple was denied. A route to New York was critical if the Concorde was to be a financial success. It was where most of Concorde's clientele would center. Businessmen and women, and entertainers who wanted a quick trip across the Atlantic. New Yorkers were worried about sonic booms. Manhattan and its great source of potential revenue seemed to be out of the question. Still, even if the Great Canyons of New York were beyond Concorde's reach, the US East Coast came into reach. Early in 1976, the US Secretary of Transportation, William Coleman, gave permission for Concorde to fly to Washington. Soon, Concorde was heading east in a dash across the Atlantic.